If the world's most powerful military can capture a president without firing a single missile, does that mean war is becoming obsolete or invisible? In the early hours of one night in Caracas, a decision was executed with surgical precision. No invasion, no airstrikes, just a narrow window, a single target, and absolute silence. The operation worked, and that was the problem. Because once a leader can be taken alive, the rules that once restrained global conflict begin to collapse quietly, legally, and all at once. And for more than a decade, Venezuela has existed at the center of a geopolitical deadlock. On one side stands Nicolás Maduro, a leader recognized by some governments, rejected by others, and accused by U.S. authorities of narcotics, trafficking, corruption, and the systematic dismantling of democratic institutions. On the other side stands Washington, constrained by international law, regional stability concerns, and the bitter memory of failed regime change operations elsewhere. Direct military intervention was never a realistic option. An invasion would ignite regional backlash, strain alliances, and risk civilian casualties on a massive scale. Airstrikes would decapitate infrastructure, not authority. Sanctions, already severe, had hardened positions rather than collapsing them. That left a far narrower, more dangerous option: removal of the individual, not the system. From a strategic standpoint, capturing a head of state is fundamentally different from killing one. A capture preserves legal leverage, intelligence value, and the possibility, however slim, of negotiated transition. It also avoids the irreversible political shock that follows an assassination, but it comes with extreme risk. Timing must be exact, intelligence must be precise, and the operation must end quickly before the state apparatus realizes what is happening. Caracas itself complicates everything. The city is dense, unpredictable, and politically polarized. Maduro's security architecture is layered: elite presidential guards, intelligence services with overlapping jurisdictions, and informal militias whose loyalty is personal rather than institutional. Any foreign operation inside the capital risks triggering spontaneous armed resistance, not by design, but by chaos. From Washington's perspective, the objective was never to win Caracas militarily. The objective was control of escalation, capture the target, exit cleanly, present the world with a legal fait accompli before counter-narratives could solidify. But strategy on paper is one thing, strategy under friction is another. Because the closer an operation moves towards success, the smaller the margin for error becomes, and the higher the cost of miscalculations. Preparation began long before any aircraft moved or any door was breached. This phase was quiet, procedural, and relentless. Intelligence collection focused less on hardware and more on behavior patterns of movement changes and routine gaps created by human habit, rather than technological failure. From the U.S. side, planners treated Caracas as a living system. Satellite imagery provided structure, but it was human intelligence that shaped the timeline. When did the targets sleep? Which entrances were ceremonial, and which were used out of convenience? Which security layers responded to alarms, and which froze, waiting for confirmation from above? What mattered most was not the strength of Maduro's protection, but its predictability. A full-scale intelligence fusion effort narrowed the window to a single night. The target would be stationary. Key members of the inner security ring would be present but not reinforced. External patrol density would be low, relying on the assumption that no foreign force would dare operate openly inside the capital. Inside the planning cell, everything revolved around time, not hours, minutes. The mission parameters were brutally simple: enter, isolate, secure, extract. Any deviation beyond that sequence increased the probability of escalation exponentially. On the Venezuelan side, the picture looked very different. Security services were alert but not alarmed. There were rumors, there are always rumors in Caracas, but no actionable warning. The protective detail trusted redundancy, overlapping units, multiple command chains, and the belief that even if one layer failed, another would respond in time. That belief would prove decisive. As final checks were completed, operators focused on the smallest details: radio discipline, hand signals, contingency routes. No speeches, no heroics, just repetition. The kind that strips emotion out of decision-making. Because once the first move was made, there would be no pause button, and no second chance. The first breach did not announce itself with gunfire or explosions. It began with silence. Just before 3 a.m., multiple actions unfolded almost simultaneously, each one designed to look insignificant on its own. A camera feed dropped for less than 10 seconds. A checkpoint radio went quiet, then came back online with a routine status update. To anyone monitoring casually, nothing appeared wrong. Inside the compound, the operation moved fast and deliberately. The entry team avoided main corridors, choosing service passages and access points rarely used by senior personnel. The goal was not dominance, it was invisibility. Every second spent fighting was a second stolen from the extraction window. From the American perspective, this was the most dangerous phase. The closer the team moved toward the target, the more fragile the entire mission became. A single raised voice, a single delayed response. Any of it could trigger a cascade of alarms that no tactical skill could fully contain. When contact finally occurred, it was brief and controlled. The inner security detail was not defeated so much as overwhelmed by speed and confusion. Orders conflicted. Radios crackled with overlapping instructions. No one knew if this was an internal breach, an assassination attempt, or something even worse. Then the mission reached its defining moment. The target was located not where the outer defenses suggested he should be, but where habit had placed him. Intelligence had predicted this correctly, but prediction does not remove tension. It only sharpens it. The team isolated the room in seconds, cutting off external communication before confirmation could spread through the security network. At that point, tactically, the mission was a success. And strategically, the real danger began. Because capture is not the end of a special operation, it is the beginning of its most vulnerable phase. Within minutes, fragments of information began leaking outward. A senior figure was missing. Movement inside the compound was restricted. Units that had never trained together started converging on the same location without clear command authority. This is where the plan met reality. Extraction routes that looked clean on a map became uncertain as spontaneous checkpoints appeared. Civilian traffic minimal moments earlier surged unpredictably. No one fired blindly, but everyone was nervous, and nervous men make irreversible mistakes. At the same time, beyond Caracas, signals were being detected. Diplomatic channels lit up. Intelligence services in neighboring countries noticed unusual activity. What had been a covert action was now racing against the clock to become a political fact before it could be reframed as an act of war. For the operators on the ground, none of that mattered. Their world had narrowed to distance, time, and control. Keep the target secure. Avoid escalation. Reach the extraction point before the city fully understood what had just happened. They moved. Not fast enough to draw attention, not slow enough to invite resistance. And behind them, Caracas was beginning to wake up into a reality no one had planned for. The defensive response did not come as a coordinated counterattack, it came as confusion. Inside the Venezuelan security apparatus, alarms moved faster than authority. Units closest to the compound reacted first, but without a clear picture of what had occurred. Some believed an internal coup was underway. Others assumed an assassination attempt had failed. A few critically suspected a foreign operation, but could not confirm it. That uncertainty slowed everything. Orders conflicted. One command instructed units to lock down districts. Another demanded restraint to avoid civilian panic. Communications bottlenecked as senior leadership struggled to establish who was in charge and who was missing. On the streets, the effects were subtle but dangerous. Checkpoints appeared without warning. Armed personnel stopped vehicles based on instinct rather than intelligence. No one wanted to be responsible for firing the first shot that could justify escalation. From the defensive perspective, this was the paradox of layered security redundancy without unity. Each layer waited for validation from another, assuming someone else had the full picture. Meanwhile, the priority quietly shifted. It was no longer about stopping the intruders. It was about controlling the narrative. Information suppression began almost immediately. Internet disruptions, conflicting official statements, denials issued before facts were known. The objective was simple: buy time, prevent panic, prevent fragmentation. But time was the one resource they did not have, because beyond the capital, international observers were already piecing together fragments. A leader unaccounted for, unusual military movement, diplomatic silence where there should have been outrage. The defensive systems of a state are built to repel force. They are far less prepared to process disappearance. And by the time clarity began to form, the situation had already moved beyond the reach of tactical response. At its core, this operation was not defined by firepower, but by sequencing. A capture mission against a sitting head of state belongs to a narrow category of military action, often described as direct action with strategic restraint. Unlike a decapitation strike where the objective is permanent removal, through lethal force capture operations are designed to preserve optionality. Intelligence exploitation, legal proceedings, diplomatic leverage, each of these requires the target to remain alive, controlled, and presentable. That requirement fundamentally reshapes tactics. Speed replaces dominance. Surprise replaces suppression. Most importantly, restraint replaces destruction. Every weapon carried becomes a liability if it cannot be used without triggering escalation. Every decision is filtered through a single question: does this action increase the chance of international confrontation? From a technical standpoint, the success of such missions hinges on two factors: time compression and information isolation. Time compression means forcing the target's security apparatus to react faster than it can coordinate. In dense urban environments, layered defenses often rely on hierarchical confirmation orders moving upward before permission moves downward. By exploiting that delay, a small force can move decisively without encountering organized resistance. Information isolation is equally critical. Cutting or delaying communication even briefly prevents defenders from distinguishing between internal disorder and external attack. In this case, confusion worked as a force multiplier. Security units hesitated not because they lacked capability, but because they lacked clarity. But this approach has hard limits. The longer a capture operation remains unresolved, the faster it transitions from tactical problem to strategic crisis. Once the target is secured, every additional minute increases exposure to political, legal, and military consequences. Extraction becomes more complex than insertion, because the environment is now actively adapting. This is why such missions are rarely attempted and almost never acknowledged. They demand flawless execution, perfect intelligence, and a degree of political risk tolerance that few governments are willing to accept. Even when tactically successful, they can generate consequences far beyond the battlefield. In modern conflict, the most difficult operations are no longer those that defeat enemy forces. They are the ones that must survive the world's reaction afterward. The immediate aftermath did not unfold on the streets of Caracas, but across conference tables and secure phone lines around the world. Within hours, the disappearance and then confirmation of a sitting head of state triggered a legal and diplomatic storm. At the United Nations, emergency consultations focused less on Venezuela itself and more on precedent. If a foreign power could capture a national leader without a declared state of war, what limits still existed on sovereignty? The immediate aftermath did not unfold on the streets of Caracas, but across conference tables and secure phone lines around the world. Within hours, the disappearance and then confirmation of a sitting head of state triggered a legal and diplomatic storm. At the United Nations, emergency consultations focused less on Venezuela itself and more on precedent. If a foreign power could capture a national leader without a declared state of war, what limits still existed on sovereignty? Economically, the shock was immediate. Venezuelan bonds spiked and dipped within the same trading window, reflecting uncertainty rather than optimism. Markets were trying to price something they rarely encounter: a sudden removal of political risk without a clear transition plan. Inside Venezuela, the effects were slower but deeper. Power did not vanish, it fractured. Competing factions claimed continuity, legitimacy, and authority. Security forces that once answered to a single center now waited to see which voice would prevail. In that vacuum, stability depended less on ideology than on control of institutions. For Washington, the operation created a strategic paradox. Tactically, it demonstrated reach, precision, and restraint. Strategically, it invited scrutiny. Allies asked hard questions, adversaries took notes. Legal scholars debated whether this was law enforcement at scale or a new form of warfare. The long-term impact would not be measured in days or weeks. It would be measured in how future conflicts redefine the boundary between military action and global governance. What unfolded in Caracas was not simply a high-risk special operation. It was a demonstration of how modern power now operates at the intersection of force law and perception. From a purely tactical standpoint, the mission proved that a small, disciplined unit supported by precise intelligence and strict restraint can penetrate even the most guarded political centers without triggering immediate collapse. Speed, confusion, and controlled ambiguity replaced overwhelming firepower. In that narrow sense, the operation succeeded. But strategy is never confined to the moment of success. The capture of a head of state does not end a conflict, it transforms it. Authority does not disappear, it disperses. Legitimacy does not transfer automatically, it is contested. And the absence of a leader creates not clarity, but a vacuum that must be filled carefully or not at all. More importantly, the operation forced a global reckoning. It challenged long-held assumptions about sovereignty intervention and the limits of military action in a world that claims to be governed by rules. If power can act decisively without declaring war, then the definition of war itself begins to blur. For future planners, the lesson is sobering. Precision and restraint may reduce bloodshed, but they do not eliminate consequences. Every operation now lives far beyond the battlefield inside courtrooms, markets, alliances, and public memory. In the end, this was not a story about how a leader was captured. It was a story about how modern conflict no longer ends with victory but begins with responsibility. Bye for now.